Our AI is going to work in a very specific way. And to fully understand what's going on, I'm going to do a couple things as I go through this. I'm going to make sure we actually will track what's happening in our network tab as it happens. So you understand, because the more that we know this, the more that you're going to be able to customize this for your own use cases and purposes. And the more that you're going to be able to build your own applications and integrate this into whatever sort of software that you're wanting to build inside of Bildr. Or even if you build this on top of other software and you integrate it through a widget or a Chrome extension, whatever that is, we want to make sure it's easy for you to do that, which requires you knowing how it works. So let's go back into our studio here and take a look at our OpenAI chat call. The first thing that we did in our setup video, you just have to make sure you have your OpenAI security key here. If you didn't watch that, no big deal. All you have to do is go to secrets. You've got this little secret right here. You can add a secret, name it whatever you want. And then you copy and then paste in the value of the secret that you get from OpenAI. So I'm gonna go ahead and archive that secret. And then all you'll do is you'll select it in this dropdown, allowing it to be used whenever you need to run this call. It's important to know, if you're not too familiar with secrets, secrets are something that we use frequently in development because our API keys are secure. They can cost us money when they're used, OpenAI being one of those examples. And they oftentimes secure information that needs to be protected to specific individuals that have permission to access it. And so we have a secret system that, one, allows you to not have to constantly copy and paste it over and over again, because it should be a little bit more of a formal process when you put a security key in place. And then two, when something is a secret in Bildr, we will never allow it to be sent to the browser, to the client side in your applications. So let's say you ran an API call, and to clarify, this is an API call. We've just dressed it up a lot better to make it easier to work with OpenAI. But let's say you were doing your own OpenAI call where you use our open-ended API call, a custom one. They let you do in it whatever you wanted. If you accidentally chose a client-side API action, Bildr would prevent you from sending that API key to the browser. Your OpenAI action wouldn't work because your API key wouldn't be there locally for it to use. However, you also wouldn't ever risk exposing that key to the public and potentially having someone use your key to go spend your money. So that's what's going on with the API key and why it's important to manage secrets in the correct way. Now let's go into the rest of this process. First, we have our OpenAI chat where we have the behavior of system role that's being set into behavior from the variable system role. So now it's important to remember that on page load of our conversation page, we set system role to "you are a helpful assistant." So when we are completing this action right now, if we have not changed this value of the system role and it was a new conversation, that's the value that it would have. There's two areas that we actually can shift the value of system role. First, if we go to page binding, in addition to running our page binding to go get the messages on the screen, in addition to hiding our prompts, and then in addition to showing our messages, we also set the same system role variable we set to the conversation. So we go to from input type, we do from a data collection. And in this case, we're wanting to just get one specific value out of the conversation record. We want to get that value that is set into the current conversation that we have on the page. Because of the way our flows are set up, we will never get to page binding unless the ID is already known, because on page load, if the ID is not known, we don't send them the page binding. We send the route to open a page without a record, which only sets these prompts through actions and not through page binding. So we haven't run page binding unless there is an ID known on the page. So what we do is we go to our conversation collection and we say, I want my initial behavior. And that's the only field that I want to get in return. And I'm going to filter this value by looking at the ID of the conversations collection filtered by the current variable ID on the page. So I know whether I set a record through the conversation name row page, or I've already started a new conversation through an action. I've eventually run page binding. So when we do an OpenAI call, we eventually get to page binding. And that means that I can guarantee that ID is set when I run page binding. And so I can go get this initial behavior value to use inside of my OpenAI prompts. And so we reset this variable system role to whatever comes back in this initial behavior for our conversation that we find with the ID we have on the page. Now, one other thing that we do is by default, the data format, when we do a data collection input type, by default, it's selected a JSON array. Now, when we want just one value, I don't want to have brackets around it, which is what would happen with a JSON array. There'd be brackets around my value. And while I don't want commas in it either, commas don't show up unless I have multiple values I'm getting, because the comma would separate each separate value. By getting just one value in this field, narrowing it down by ID, meaning there's only going to be ever one value returned, and then using comma separated, I know I'm just going to get the actual value from the data collection in my conversations for initial behavior. So if I were to, let's say, this was the active conversation, and I filtered it by the ID, my variable for system role would now be integrations mentor, because I would go get that specific value from this data collection, and it would be on the page for me. The other important thing to mention in this process is that we're going to always, by default, use cache. And what that means is Bildr knows if certain data is already available to us on the page. In many instances, this data will always be here for us, so we don't have to go do a network call to go ask the database and the server to send it to us. It's already going to be for us, and we're going to do it locally, meaning we speed up your application without you having to worry about that. Normally, as you build an application ground up, you don't have that same context, so you have to build the logic that knows if it happens to be available locally or not. And Bildr does that for you automatically instead. So if we go back to our OpenAI call, that's where we're getting our system role. I'll talk after I go through the first example of an AI action for a new conversation here. I'll talk about if we had started this from a prompt and how that looks too. So we get our behavior, which is a system role. This is a system message that gets sent to the AI that says, here's how you're supposed to act. It doesn't show up inside of our conversation. It's simply context for the AI to know how to act when they're talking to the person they're chatting with. Another really important example that I like to bring up with system roles, it's a way to send information to the AI so that it can have context that maybe your user isn't going to ask it, or maybe they're not going to have, and you're having the AI discern the answer to a conversation based off of something that you've given it. So let's say you were using this for customer support for your application, and you wanted the AI to be able to know about this customer's billing history with you, like their bills the last 3 months. Well, something that you could do is you could send in this behavior prompt, you could say, hey, you are a helpful expert for our company in customer support. Here's all the information about this client. And you could list out the data about that client in any format you want. I'd recommend JSON. I'll have other videos talking about the importance of using JSON with AI and how much of a superpower that is. But you could give it all the context here so that maybe if your user's question was, hey, can you tell me my last 3 months of billing? If you gave the AI the information in a system prompt, it would know it already and be able to respond to your user in the way that they were asking it, because the AI would then actually have that important information that it needed to do what it was asked. That's one example of how you could use the system prompt. They've already said in future iterations of ChatGPT, they're going to be weighing the system prompt more and more, allowing you to give it more context to behave in the way that you really want it to behave. Currently, a system prompt can oftentimes get overridden by a chat message, and they're going to be altering the models so that you could choose to factor in the system prompt more and more and the user's prompts less and less. So all that talk about prompts has us moving into what we actually have here as the prompt. The prompt is simply the message that we send to the AI to get a response back. One ultimately really important thing about prompts is that every single time that you send a new request to AI, it has no idea of anything you've ever asked it before. It simply doesn't know. It didn't track your IP address to know that person just said this, so that now they're asking this. So what that means is we actually need to deliver it, not just the information that was just given to us. We actually need to build a set of information for the whole conversation history so that the AI can respond with all of the context of our conversation that we've just asked it. So although in this case, in our Bildr action here, we're just mapping this new message variable, which we set via the input here, what Bildr is actually doing is going to get all of the historical information for this conversation, plus this brand new message, and it's combining all of this information into a single prompt to give to the AI to say, here's our whole conversation history. Normally you would have to go through a bunch of hoops to go get the data, rearrange it in the right order so it knows what the most recent message is, and then give it that value as a part of the API call. Bildr narrows it so you don't have to do that. And the way that we know to get the right information is this next grouping of properties here. So we have this option for you to choose a storage method. We were using the Bildr data collection in this example. You can also use local storage, which is something that stores a local variable in a cookie, or rather in local storage, not a cookie actually. In local storage, it stores an ID for the conversation as well as the message history. So you could actually deliver the same app experience to a user on their specific computer, and none of the data would ever be stored in your data collection, and the user would still be able to see and use the information that they had stored in their local browser. If they were to switch computers or clear out their browser history, they would lose that. But that would be another way for you to do it if you didn't want to use Bildr's data collection storage. And then you've also got custom. Custom opens it up so you can use any sort of method that you want. Let's say you're using OpenAI actions and you used a Xano backend, or you had a custom backend, but you wanted to keep using Bildr's AI actions. You could use custom, and it gives you some more flexibility in mapping things the way that you want to do. Or again, you could just use our regular API call. If you didn't want to use this structure, you could just use an API call and just do it all yourself. This, I can say, saves a lot of headache, the process of getting all this data together. And I'm going to show you this in action here in a moment. So we've chosen our Bildr data collection as our storage method. Then we get our conversation ID. We pull that from the variable ID on the page. This is why it's so critical. In the previous step, if there wasn't yet a conversation on the page, we had to go create one first and get the ID back, because this information is necessary for us to group our messages together. The next things that we do is go to identify the collection that has our messages, which is our messages collection in this case. We identify the type, which is type or role. This is important because this is what clarifies if this is a user message, the assistant message, or the system message. As we talked about earlier, this system role shows up as a system message, but I want to make sure the AI knows something that I said in our conversation history or something that it said. So we automatically store and then retrieve the role of the source of that message to help build your chat history when we send an OpenAI action out. Next, we actually refer to just the messages field itself. Where is the message that was said? Then we look at the timestamp field to make sure we're ordering it appropriately. So in the same way that we do a Unix timestamp for our conversations, inside of our action here, we're doing all the work to assign this a Unix timestamp so that on our messages page, we can organize that appropriately. And then finally, we refer to where in our message collection is the conversation ID stored. So we can choose our conversation ID. If you were doing this in a different collection, you could just clarify where are you storing it, because that's our relational collection, allowing us to know what conversations are specifically supposed to be had based off of where this matches. So when we start a new conversation, we're not grabbing anything else because there's nothing else there. The final two fields that we have here are a flow to run after we send the message to the AI. And then right after that, we do a flow to run when we get a successful reply back from the AI. The reason that we have these separated out, especially in the case of AI, is these calls can take a significant length of time sometimes. So I've seen circumstances that some calls could take 3 minutes, depending on the content being given to them. And we don't want the user to be waiting that whole time for their message to not pop up in the page. So what we do here is we run page binding, which will go and get the message that they just sent and set it into the page, creating that experience that we want. It also hides the prompts, shows the messages. So it's giving us the behavior on screen that we want to make it feel like a brand new conversation was actually just started or a new message was just sent. Because as I'll show you in a second, some of the things that we do before we even send the OpenAI call is we create the messages in our messages collection so that we can then see them on the page before we're waiting for this AI to reply. So that's why we run this flow here when we send the message, so that something happens as soon as we do this. In our case, we've already shown our waiting animation. We've already set variables and things like that from our message inputs. There could absolutely be circumstances in which you maybe do that all as a part of this flow if you wanted to. In this case, I wanted to make sure I set up some of the structure around what should happen when someone sends a message first. And so that's why this is happening after a few functions already. After we run the API call, get a successful response, we run our successful call re-enable messages input. And what that does, if you remember, when we first started this process, we disabled our message input. We disabled this button. So I'm now re-enabling them so that they can be used again. I'm also running our page binding again so that we guarantee that this page binding will happen and we'll go get the new messages and put them into the page. And then I'm also rerunning this set system role variable. Now this is important because if we just created a new conversation, we may have just given it a new system role value that you are a helpful assistant. And when I send the prompt again, I want to make sure I'm getting the system role associated with this specific conversation. And so by running page binding and including this value right here, we're making sure that it's always set to the conversation that we're having and not maybe resetting it on accident by referring to the variable that was set on page load. So there was one other thing that we do on successful call, which is just hide the waiting animation. So our little squiggly thing that rotates right here for us, we want to make sure we hide it after we have a successful call completed so we can make it feel like we're no longer waiting, which is what that hide animation does there. So that's what happens when we send an AI call. Depending on its route, we're doing a sequence of things visually on the screen. If there's no conversation yet, we're creating a conversation. And then we do the OpenAI call, which actually creates the message and then sends it to the AI. It then creates the message from the AI's response, all inside of that conversation. And then it allows us to go run page binding to display that data on the page. Now, I'm going to show you this all happen live in our network tab here in a moment. But the other way that we've talked about starting a conversation is not just from our send a message input here. There's also a way to start a conversation from our prompts row page. I'm going to get into detail on some of the other things our prompts row page does, especially because it's used in a couple of different spots of our app. But if I go to flow and I see our start new conversation with prompts page, I want to select that. there's a few important things in here that I want to point out. First, we run a flow called disable clicks on prompts, and we run it on our prompts row page. This is being run on every single instance of our prompts row page, including the current one. So we haven't limited by a variable value. We haven't limited to all except the current page. We're disabling this click on prompts. And what that means is they can't double click the prompt really fast to accidentally start 2 API calls, or they couldn't click from one, then click to the other and confuse the system because the prompts are no longer clickable. It's the first thing that happens. The next thing that we do is we add the prompt selected style class to it. So although this prompts selected box here goes away fairly quickly, I want to make sure that it feels selected. So we automatically go ahead and add an attribute that allows this green hover to be locked in. So it doesn't disappear anymore if I've selected it. If I move away from it, it's selected, so it'll stay there. And that's what that selected prompt div is doing. Next, if you recall, our actual input for text input, really the first thing that we did was just set a bunch of variables. And that's what we're doing exactly right here. We're setting variables to the parent page. So because in this case, our prompts row is existing on our conversation page. So relative to our prompts row, when we're on this page, this conversation page is the parent. It's the one directly above it, which is always what the parent page means in Bildr. It's one page above. If you were to build out a page, if you were to put a page on another one, it's the page that your other page is on top of. In that same way, when we open up our conversations page into our Bildr homepage here for the app, this would be the parent of this page right here. And so that's what's going on here is we're setting this new message variable to the parent page, putting it right here. Then we're setting our name variable to this page, and we're setting our system role variable to the page. So when we select this, we are overriding the system role value that was set on page load on our conversation page. And what we're doing with our prompt is we've already created the information that we want to start this process. So what we do is when we do new message, we grab the description value on the page, and that's our new message to start the conversation. To name the conversation, we grab the prompt name and assign it to the variable name. And in the same way, we also assign the system role variable the prompt name as well. So I could name my prompt, you are a helpful assistant, you are an expert car mechanic, and that would be the name of the conversation as well as the system role and the role that we're giving to the AI to start the process. The best part about the way that we design in Bildr is that we are built to reuse as much of our work as possible. So the same way you're visually seeing I'm reusing the work of building this page one time in 2 different spots, I'm also reusing my entire flow for interacting with the AI this way. After I set these variables, I run the flow on our parent page, which is the conversation page, and I just say, show the waiting animation. If you recall, our show waiting animation is the same thing that we do after we set the variables from the text input. We run it right here, and regardless of the way that we started it, we know we're doing the same thing next. We disable the text inputs. So maybe we typed out a few things first, and then we hit the prompt. Well, the few things that were typed out there are disabled. We eventually remove them. We show our thinking animation div. And then after we do all that, we go ahead and check to see if there's an ID on the page. If we started from the prompt, we know the ID isn't there because the prompts never show up unless there's no ID on the page. And so we still do the same logic check where is ID known? No, it's not going to be known in this case. So then we go to our create a new conversation record and we start creating our conversation record. But this time we've actually set some of these values from our prompt. So we set name, the variable name, from the name of our prompt. Our timestamp is still just a part of the system, so we don't have to worry about that. This didn't change at all. But our initial behavior, we also set from the name of our prompt. We could choose to add an additional system role and title field there to our prompts. Just currently, this is the way that we're set up. And so we create the record, and now we have our ID for us to then do our OpenAI call. And we've given all of the context the OpenAI conversation needs to appropriately run. Although we haven't run page binding again yet to get the system role from our data collection itself, we just set it from our prompts row, so we know it's going to be accurate to what we really want that prompt to be. And then the rest of the process pulls the new message that we set from the description of the prompt. And then we do the same exact process. What Bildr is creating and getting a sequence of records so that we can power our entire conversation chat history with OpenAI to continue it. So now let's go ahead and see what this process looks like. Let's go to our page right here. And I'm going to open our inspect element. I've already demoed this a little bit for you. So I want to show you what's happening in our network call as these things happen. So we've got a new conversation open right now. I can click on my new message and say, hey there, how are you doing? We're going to see a sequence of things happen in network, which again is when data gets sent back and forth, when API calls get sent, they're going to pop up right here for us to see. So I sent my message, I saw it pop up there. I temporarily saw my waiting animation, and then I get my reply back from the AI. But what actually occurred to allow all of this to happen? At the beginning of every single API call from a Bildr collection, we have the ID of the filter set of the data collection that is being called from. So whether we're getting data or posting data, we can look directly at this number, this string right here, and know what it was actually doing. Our MCU, as we can look like, this is a record save action. And we know the very first thing that we did for our API calls was actually create our conversation. Because if we didn't have a conversation yet, which we didn't when we started this, we need to go create it. So the payload that we actually send over is, first of all, hey there, how are you doing? This is our conversation name. So we have, hey there, how are you doing? This is our conversation name. You are a helpful assistant. This is the value that we pulled from the variable systemPrompt because we started it from a message. And then this is the Unix timestamp of the moment that we sent it. So it gives us all the information that we need, or we sent all the information so that we could create a record in our conversations data collection. And in the response, we told it was saved. And if we go into the actual object recs here, we can find this ID field, QM5AZ. So if I copy that, I can go into my data collections now, go to conversations, and I can see, if I just search it, I can see ID QM5AZ, and I can see all this information, and we just created this a moment ago in that API call. Now let's go back and see what happened next. I see two R7E calls here. The first thing that we do is we do a records get for this conversation history. And so ID, if we look it up, is actually going to be our messages collection. So if we go to the filter set ID for our messages collection, R7E. So what we did there was, hey, can you send me all of the messages that exist, but we're going to filter it by the relationship field for our conversations IDs. So this is the field 41x. We want to see all the messages when the value of this field is equal to the conversation ID that we just made. So 41x, and that 41x has to be equal to QM5AZ, which again was the ID of the conversation that we just made. So this is a record that we did automatically. when we go back to our flow for sending a message, ultimately, when ID isn't known, we created this flow that did create new record for conversation. And that was what we saw first. But then we're seeing a sequence of API calls happening because of what happens with this OpenAI action. And that's what this is. It goes and gets all the messages. It sees that there's no messages history, so it doesn't have to do anything with these. But next, it goes ahead and updates the messages collection with the message that we just sent. So, hey there, how are you doing? That was what I just typed in. So now it went and got the other messages. It created a message, record save, created a new message from the user for this conversation. And then it did our HTTP call. And this is going to be our API request in Bildr. This is going to be what actually got sent to OpenAI. So if we look at the payload, I can see the URL that this was ultimately sent to is this right here. I can look at the content and I can see the messages that were sent. There is 2 that were sent. There's first a system message with the content, you are a helpful assistant. And then there's our message that we just sent, hey there, how are you doing? So Bildr arranged the messages in order to give the right inputs to the AI to be able to perform the way that we wanted. And then it arranged the rest of the information that we needed so that it followed OpenAI's guidelines. If you're curious to look a little bit more closely, you definitely can at their docs, but this is like the format that they want their API key to come in, and it's the format for their API to work in general. So what happens at that point, once we get the response back, we've given it a set of flows to do exactly next. But there's also one other thing the action does automatically for us. Once we get the reply back, we're going to see another R7E update because we're saving another new message because this is the AI's message. This is the AI's response back. And so we just created an assistant message and hello, I'm a computer program. And that's what displays right here because it's another new message and it's attached to our QM5A conversation ID, bridging the gap so that all of these together and ordered for us to look at. So if I jump into our data collections and I go to messages, I'm now going to see my conversation with the AI of this is the user message and this is the assistant message. And the system prompt message in our design, if you recall, was saved to the conversation ID itself. And so by default, our action is always going to use the initial system prompt behavior of you are a helpful assistant. And you could adapt this to, again, use in your own way, shape, or form. It really depends on your use case of the chat. If you want to give it other information, if you want to, you can also send system messages as a part of the conversation if you wanted to. And so there's all sorts of things you can do as you specialize this for yourself and your use cases. But that's what's going on in this action, is a series of go and look at the conversation ID, go and create the new message record, send the OpenAI call, or rather get all the message history, send the new message in, make sure we're ordering all of them correctly along our timestamp. Then let's go send the call to OpenAI. Let's receive the call back. Let's create the record for the new conversation that we just received back. Or if it was our storage method was a different process, we could store it in local storage or a custom route if you chose to. And so you can really do whatever you want to with the action, but we've stored 4 or 5 pieces of the puzzle here just inside this for you so you don't have to think about it at all. And so let's continue the conversation. I'll just say there, send it again. Hey there, let's send another message. And this time, what we're going to see is we didn't have to create a conversation this time because we skipped that because the variable ID was already known. So we skipped that part in our threads. We just went directly to the OpenAI call. But we didn't have to also go get the conversations this time either because Bildr knows that it already has all this data locally. So it skips one of the API calls to go get the records. It just saves the new one that we're sending in and it adds this new user message of, hey there, that I just sent there. And then when we go to our HTTP call, we can again look at our content, look at our content's messages, and see that we've sent our system message, our original user message, our assistant message that we got back, and then also our new user message that we just sent. So we're getting all of the information here that we needed to send the right information. So the AI, again, every new API call is a brand new conversation to them. We just make it feel like one conversation by grouping all these messages together. And then we group it all together and send it. And then we ultimately wait for a response back, which comes back from the AI. If we go to choices.message.content, hello again, how can I assist you today? And that's the value that we automatically put in your messages collection for you and let you do whatever you need to with it. And so ultimately, we display it with that response, but we also have the record save right here for that new reply as well. So hopefully you have a little bit more of an understanding of, one, how this template works, two, how OpenAI works, and three, how you can start to maybe customize and manipulate this template to bring into your projects to use in many other use cases. I know I've got quite a few things I'm going to be building with it over time as well. The other thing I wanted to demonstrate for you with the network tab open before we move on to our messages page and our prompts management process, I wanted to go ahead and show you what it looked like to start a new conversation from a prompt. Let's go ahead and click No Code Tools. I'm going to clear this out one more time and click No Code Tools. So we saw it's showing my animation right here because it ran the animation process here. That kicked off the process for us to look at the ID to see if it was known. It knew it wasn't. So we look and we see our record saved for creating a new conversation right there. We then see our records get, because it doesn't yet know that there's no messages for this conversation because it's a brand new ID for it. So it runs the get, it sees that nothing comes back. It creates our first message from the user, it creates that message record. We then send the OpenAI call right here and say, hey, here's our request. If you can recall too, remember from our prompts, we're not using the You Are a Helpful Assistant. We've customized this a little bit. So if we actually look at our preview, or rather our payload, I go to content and I go to message, I can see that my system message now is not You Are a Helpful Assistant, it's just No Code Tools. Certainly I could label that in a different way if I wanted to, but then our second message is still from the user, and it's the content from the description that was inside of our prompt. And that's what triggers the process for it to give us these details right here. Once we get a reply back, we get a response, 200 OK, successful. We go ahead and create a new record, again, a new message record for the reply back from the AI. That's what this value is right here. And then in Bildr, we run page binding. Initially, whenever we first start the conversation, rather when we first sent the message, and then also on success, we re-enable the buttons, run page binding again, and hide the waiting animation. Now, one thing that's important to know, and I didn't mention this on the first video, I realize, is we are running page binding in this case to make sure our elements on the page that are being set by page binding are up to date. Bildr also has something else built in called data listeners. And data listeners are a way for you to assign a page to run a specific flow. We call them action group here, to run a specific action group whenever there is an update to the messages collection, in this case, or any collection, that is also data bound to the page. And so you can also limit this to specific things like, oh, only if this field changes, I want to run this, or only if the messages collection has a new one added or one taken away, do I want you to run this? I usually keep this open-ended, but you could certainly choose to adjust when you want that. But this page binding group is running every time our messages collection is updated in one way or another. And it's only running when our messages that are data bound to our page would be influenced. So it knows at all times, hey, I'm listening at all times for our messages collection to have some sort of update. And I'm actually filtering even that listening down to the messages that have the conversations ID set right here. And that's what I'm going to be listening for. And so it's always listening for that input. And when it receives an input, it actually, in this case, we set it to run our page binding group. And so automatically, if the messages collection changes, we're going to go ahead and run page binding. And so that's what's occurring here, is that effect of automatically doing this. Now, we have, in this case, automatically done some work for this by running page binding through the AI action. If we actually take this away, what we should see when we open an existing collection to the page, it should work this way. Let's refresh the page, just sort of blank slate here. We're going to load up the page. We're going to authenticate the user, and we're going to load that user's conversations, and then we're going to load our user's message right here into the main area. There we go. So I'm going to say, hey there. And if you recall, I just took away my page binding from running whenever I send this message. If I hit enter, what you saw occur anyways, even though I took away that action, it's no longer running this action. What actually occurred was Bildr knew, hey, the messages collection was just updated with the information relevant to this page. So I need to go run this page binding flow automatically. So as soon as Bildr saw, we created a new conversation. That didn't do anything in this case on our page right here. What did happen is right here, this R7E is our messages conversation, and it wasn't our records get that actually ran it, but this record save created a new record in that conversation with the filters that our page has set for it. And so what that means is we automatically ran the page binding for us instead. And that's why even before we got the reply back from OpenAI, we see this populate first because it comes in immediately, because we ran page binding, because of the data listener. I could even take this a step further. Let's go to the OpenAI action. And actually, successful call, enable messages input. I wanted those to happen either way, but let's just say I wanted to drop out my page binding here. So now I could put these in page binding too if I want. I don't want that to happen because I don't want the send to re-enable them. I want to make sure it's successful. So in this case, I'll just run the re-enabling of everything and hide the waiting animation. But page binding itself, again, in this case, based off this setup, will only run if it knows a message was just influenced, created, updated, or deleted in one way, shape, or form relevant to the page. So I'm going to say, hey there again. First message got created. It open-ended. It created our message for the AI response, and then it did page binding again. So our data listener just did two things for us automatically because we have that set up on our conversation page, so that it reruns page binding for us right here when we need it. We also have a data listener set up on our homepage of our BildrBot. If you go to, at the top left here, anytime you have a page selected, you'll see which pages have listeners assigned to them. And in this case, we're listening for our conversations collection. And then we rerun page binding as well. And if you hadn't noticed, our conversations on the left-hand side here are being created whenever we start a new conversation. So, hi, how are you? If I hit send, we created our conversation right here, MCUJ. It's UJ. We created that conversation. This page was listening for a new conversation for this user and went ahead and went and got it and displayed it on the page for us. And so you can use data listeners throughout your application to keep it up to date. You can create back and forth chats with other people, and you create that feeling of always keeping things up to date, because as soon as one person sends it, the other person can receive it without them having to refresh. And that data listener process is already set up inside of Bildr for you so that you don't have to worry about the relatively complicated process of making this work. And so that's how our conversation page is working, start to finish. So now that we have had a conversation with AI, we've started from a new message, we've started from an existing message. Actually, let's show that just really quick. Let's find a conversation where we've had a little bit of history. So we've changed conversations, jumped around a little bit. Let's load up this conversation right here. We've got 4 messages. Let's clear this out. And now let's start the conversation. Again, because we already had the conversation on the page, we didn't have to create a new conversation. That's why we just see the R7E and the R7E there. The first one is the records get for all the IDs. So we go and get all that. The next is we post the new message into the page, pops up immediately for us. We do the OpenAI call to get the response, and then we create the message from that response from the AI, and then the page binding picks up and automatically sets it into the page for us. So that is how our conversations page works, our conversation page gets opened from a conversation name row page, or from a new conversation on our home page. And it's also how our conversation operates from the time that this page loads to the time that it's displaying conversations with our AI. The next thing I want to jump into is our messages row page. And there's a few things going on here, so I'm going to give it its own dedicated video for you to understand what's occurring here. I integrated a third-party library that does some cool things with code, and I also have a few things going on that make this page operate uniquely, and so we'll go ahead and dive into that next.